Good morning. I would like to welcome all of you to our session on the looming federal debt limit, sponsored by three institutions active in the analysis of economic policy issues: the Georgetown University Global Economic Challenges Network, the Georgetown Center for Economic Research, and the Salve Brussels School of Economics and Management. My name is Brian Madigan. I'm a professor of the practice and director of the master's programs in economics at Georgetown University. I will serve as moderator for today's session. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and the captioned video will be posted soon to the event page on the Global Engagement website. Today's topic, the federal debt ceiling, falls squarely in the realm of political economy. In the US, today's environment for the practice of political economy is quite partisan, even polarized. Thus, it is not surprising that our democratic process for formulating fiscal policy is at present highly contentious. Without a doubt, the participants in this process all believe strongly that their respective positions represent the best policies for the US to promote the economic and social goals that they and their constituents see as appropriate. Accordingly, they seek to employ every possible rhetorical device and legislative tool to advance their objectives. As we have seen in recent days, the process does not necessarily proceed smoothly and linearly. This is the democratic process at work. But we should always be ready to look critically at whether key aspects of our federal fiscal framework could be improved. And the federal debt limit is a prime candidate for close inspection. Is the debt limit actually an appropriate and effective fiscal policy tool? I hope we can return to this question in a bit. But our immediate objective is to comprehend the potential implications of the debt ceiling as it exists today for the very near term, coming days and weeks. Fortunately, Shai Akabas is here to help us. I am especially pleased to note that Shai is a graduate of Georgetown University's master's degree program in applied economics. He is currently the director of economic policy for the Bipartisan Policy Center. Around a decade ago, he assisted Jerome Powell, now chairman of the Federal Reserve, in his work to explain the federal debt limit. Shai is a widely recognized expert on the federal budget, the federal debt, and the debt ceiling. We are very fortunate to have the benefit of Shai's expertise on this crucial topic of the debt ceiling. After Shai's presentation, I will lead off with a couple of questions, and then Shai will respond to some of your questions. Please join the conversation by opening the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen and typing in your question. Now, Shai, please go ahead.
Well, thanks, Brian, for having me and to Georgetown as well. It's great to be here with you all, at least virtually back at Georgetown. My goal here in the next 10 or 15 minutes is just to give you a sense of what's going on in the news today and what you can expect to read over the next couple weeks. As folks who have been following the headlines recently probably know, the US is up against its federal debt limit, and Congress has this as an urgent matter to take up. I'll start, Brian, on slide 4, just giving folks a basic sense of what the debt limit is. So, as most of you probably know, the US federal government is running large deficits. We've been running those deficits for many years. The last time we had a balanced budget was back in the year 2000, I believe. Late 1990s. And since then, we have been running an annual deficit, meaning that our spending is exceeding the amount of money that we're taking in revenues, primarily taxes. Each year that we have that deficit, it adds to our debt. So our debt has now grown to about $27.5 trillion. That's a lot of money. Relative to the size of the economy, that debt is, I should note, both the publicly held debt as well as the intergovernmental debt, meaning debt that's held in trust funds like the Social Security Trust Fund. But altogether, that debt is well over 100% of GDP. Even just the publicly held debt is now over 100% of GDP. On August 1st of this year, the suspension of our federal debt limit expired and the debt limit came back into effect. The debt limit is a law that has been around for about 100 years, and it limits the ability of Treasury to borrow. It was originally put in place to actually give Treasury more flexibility on borrowing, because before that, they had to actually go to Congress for each request to borrow from the public. Once the debt limit was put into effect, they had the flexibility to manage their borrowing up to that cap. What's happened now, though, is that the debt limit has become very politicized. And even though we have approved spending and tax decisions by Congress, Treasury doesn't have the ability to carry all of those out because it has not been given the authority to borrow enough money in order to raise cash to pay all of the bills. So that's why we're here talking about the debt limit today. And I'm going to give you a little bit more of the details behind where we are right now and where we're headed. So since August 1st, the Treasury Department has been using what are called extraordinary measures. We've reached this roughly $27.5 trillion level. And the Treasury Department has some legally permissible accounting maneuvers that it can exercise, which have been exercised many times in the past. So they're no longer so extraordinary, to keep the United States within its debt limit and not breach it. If we go to slide 5, you can see here what the sequence of events is. So normally Treasury issues new debt to the public to raise cash to pay the bills. Once the debt limit's reached, their ability to do that is limited. And so they start to conduct these extraordinary measures, which are effectively replacing debt that's held in trust funds with debt that's issued to the public, which actually raises cash to pay the bills. And then after the debt limit episode is resolved, those securities that are in trust funds get restored. So once those extraordinary measures are exhausted, though, they will only have the cash that they have on hand. And that's not going to be enough because we're running, again, these annual deficits. So most days there is more money going out than coming in. And they'll run out of that cash. And that's what we call at the Bipartisan Policy Center the X state, when there is no longer enough cash on hand to pay all of the bills in full and on time. And at that point, we would be missing payments on our financial obligations, or, in some terminology, it's defaulting on our financial obligations. What would come after that is a big question mark, because we've never been there before. It's never been the case in the modern era that the United States was unable to pay all of its bills in full and on time. Brian, if we could, let's go to slide 12. And here you'll see a chart that just shows our projection of the X date. Now, we at the Bipartisan Policy Center have been working on the debt limit for over 10 years now. As Brian was noting at the top, it started when Fed Chair Jay Powell was at BPC, and I had the privilege of working with him on this. And we have refined our model to try to project when that point is that the federal government is going to run out of cash. This is very different from a government shutdown for a number of reasons, and I can get into that more in the question and answer. But one big reason is that we know when the government shutdown is going to happen, the partial government shutdown. That would have been today, October 1st, because that's when the new fiscal year starts. And so if Congress hasn't appropriated the funding, then there's a partial government shutdown. When it comes to the X date and the debt limit, what we're talking about here is the government running out of cash. And because there are hundreds of millions of bills that are going in and out of the government each month, it takes a very complex model. And even then, there's a lot of uncertainty around what that date is going to be. So here you can see what the cash, basically the room under the debt limit, which combines the cash and the extraordinary measures, those accounting maneuvers that I said before, has looked like since August. It was on a pretty steady decline in August, and then it bumped up a little bit in September, because that's when the Treasury Department gets in its quarterly tax payments for people who pay their taxes quarterly. But then starting today, actually, today is a very noteworthy day, it's going to begin to plummet. October 1st, the Treasury Department, we expect, will have about $150 billion cash flow deficit. And that's where you see that line take a sharp turn downward. And from here, they will have a dangerously low cash balance until they hit rock bottom sometime, we expect, between October 15th and November 4th. I should note that Janet Yellen has put October 18th out there in a letter that she has sent to Congress. The Treasury Department doesn't know exactly when this day is going to come either. That was their best guess, but it may move around a little bit between now and then. So what we at BPC try to do is narrow that range between now and when we get to the X date. Brian, if we could go to slide 23, please. So the big question now is, if we actually got to that X date and Congress was unable to extend the debt limit before then to give Treasury the additional room to borrow to pay all of our bills, what would happen? Nobody really knows because, again, this would be entirely unprecedented. None of the scenarios look pretty, but there's a couple that have been hypothesized. So we try to illustrate a couple of them here. One option would be that the government would prioritize bills. Prioritizing bills means you choose to pay some people and you don't pay others. So you pick winners and losers, basically. The number one obligation that they would probably prioritize is principal and interest on the US debt, because that is probably the most important of all of these in terms of economic considerations, because if we were actually to default on our debt, that could have grave consequences for the entire global economy and financial markets. So they would likely prioritize that. After we talk about that element, it's really subject to people's subjective preferences. So do you prioritize Social Security benefits, Medicare and Medicaid payments, defense vendor payments? There's, again, hundreds, even thousands of individual programs that the government conducts on a regular basis. And so if you choose to pay the programs on this list that you see in front of you right here for a total of $400 billion over the course of October 15th to November 15th, which is roughly the month after the X date could happen, then Brian, if we go to the next slide, you can see all the programs that wouldn't get paid. And this is about 40% of all of the payments that are scheduled to go out the door between October 15th and November 15th. And these are important programs that are affecting a lot of people. So money for the Small Business Administration, that's largely going to financial institutions that are forgiving paycheck protection loans, which were those small business loans that were put in place after the COVID-19 pandemic set on. The pandemic relief to state and local governments, which is helping them fund a whole host of different priorities that are responding to the pandemic and helping them recover economically. The child tax credit payments, which many of you have probably read about in the news recently, which are $250 or $300 that are going out to families with children now on the 15th of each month through the end of this year. So many families who are expecting to receive those, if this were to happen, may not receive them. So you can see that this would affect a lot of important programs: unemployment insurance benefits, veterans affairs programs, supplemental security income benefits. Those are benefits that go to very low income or disabled individuals. And again, this is not to suggest that these are necessarily the priorities that would not make the cut, but it's to show what could happen if we went down this road. Now, if we go to a couple slides down, Brian, slide 28, this shows the second scenario that we looked at. And this is one that actually has been hypothesized by some Federal Reserve officials and others as potentially the more likely of the two. And under this scenario, they would still prioritize principal and interest on the debt. And now there's a operational question about all of this as to what we are showing here are scenarios that in theory, you could prioritize all of these payments. But in practice, the federal government's operations are not set up to pay some bills and not pay others. They're set up to pay all the bills as they are processed and come due. So this is an entirely unexplored territory where we don't know that they would be able to carry out any of these operations seamlessly. But if you see here, this is a list of what could happen if they go with the second route, which is to delay all payments with the exception of principal and interest on the debt until they can make a full day's payment. So on the left, you see example payments, and there you see the date that they're due in the middle column, and then they would be delayed until a later date because it would take more days of incoming revenue for the Treasury Department to have enough to pay those bills. And these are just example bills that are due on those days, but you can see that those delays start at a few business days, but then they quickly grow over the course of just a couple of weeks to weeks-long delays. And because we're running such large federal deficits, that would quickly grow to months as well. So this becomes very untenable very quickly and could have serious economic consequences if you think about how much spending would be pulled out of the economy on such a short basis. So just to wrap up a little bit, slide 31, Brian, gives people an idea of what this looks like on a daily basis in terms of the amount of money that the government's taking in versus sending out. So you can see there that the government is, by our projections, and these are very rough, estimated to send out $43 billion on October 15th and only take in $27 billion. So that gives them limited options in terms of what they can pay and what they cannot pay. And it goes on like this, and it builds over time. And we show in our presentation that you can find on our website what these days are expected to look like. Just say a moment here on the potential consequences. A federal default on our debt would, I think, have severe ramifications for the entire economy. It's impossible to predict what exactly those are, but we would likely see rises in interest rates because investors would be less confident about holding US securities, which could mean rises in interest rates across the economy. It could potentially lead to an economic recession. It could lead to large drops in equity markets. It would likely lead to a credit rating downgrade by credit rating agencies, which we received back in 2011, which was the last time we came really, really close to that X date. And if that happens, a lot of investment funds might dump Treasury securities because many of these funds are only allowed to hold AAA securities. So that would be the worst scenario. The somewhat less bad, but still pretty bad scenario would be if we were missing payments as a federal government. There's a real credibility issue there where we are looked to as the gold standard for credit in the world. And if our securities can't be trusted like they used to be as the reserve currency, many transactions are conducted in US dollars. US dollars serve as the backstop to many US securities, Treasury securities serve as the backstop to collateral for many transactions. So if that were all to be put into question, it's hard to know exactly what the ramifications would be. And they would, of course, be dictated by global economic actors and investors, but it would be very quickly out of the control of US policymakers, which is a concerning situation. So the risks are large. We don't know exactly how large, but the time is of the essence for Congress to address this. I thought Secretary Janet Yellen had a very good quote in an op-ed that she published in the Wall Street Journal just a week or two ago, where she said, there's a big difference between avoiding default by months and by days. And we're getting very close to that days point. When you start to get into the days range, several things happen. First of all, we know that investors are going to start demanding and already have higher interest on Treasury securities that are coming due around the X date because they have ever so slightly higher concern that there's going to be some hiccup, there's going to be some problem getting repaid on time. And we also have the risk of the credit rating agency downgrade. What we got downgraded for back in 2011 was not for actually missing any payments, not for defaulting on our debt, but just because of the political brinkmanship that brought us close to the edge. So if we go there again, other credit rating agencies may decide to follow suit. So Brian, thanks again to you and Georgetown for having me. I'll pause here and look forward to the conversation with you and then answering any questions that our guests have.
Thank you very much, Shai. That was very clear and very helpful. Let me start with a question or two, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience. As a reminder, you in the audience can join the conversation by opening the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen and typing in your question. Shai, as you noted, we're only a few weeks away from the projected debt limit X date, which, as you've explained, could have severe consequences for financial markets and the US economy. What is Congress doing about this looming issue?
Unfortunately, they're not doing a whole lot right now. There are a variety of fiscal policy issues that many of you have probably read about in the news that are on Congress's plate at the moment. So the fact that these are all being conflated is posing an additional challenge to getting resolution on the debt limit this time around. So just yesterday, there was a lot of action. So yesterday, Congress passed a continuing resolution, which is an appropriations bill that will help keep the government open and avoid that partial government shutdown that I mentioned earlier until I believe it's December 3rd, sometime in early December. And that has become routine now where they don't get their appropriations bills, which fund most of the government agencies, the Department of Defense, most of the domestic agencies. They don't get those done on time for the beginning of the fiscal year. And so they pass these continuing resolutions, which just continue last year's funding into this year for an additional period of time to give them that wiggle room. So that's what's in place right now. And it was signed by the president last night. They're also debating a couple major pieces of legislation, one dealing with infrastructure that has already passed the US Senate and is being considered in the US House. And then there is another bill that the Democrats are pushing on their side to try to significantly expand spending on many social safety net programs. It's a very broad bill. It could amount to as much as $3.5 trillion in terms of the additional spending and tax cuts that are included there. We expect it'll probably be shaved down somewhat from there because some of the centrist members like Senator Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema have said that they're not comfortable with $3.5 trillion. But nonetheless, it is a very big bill on Congress's plate right now. So they're dealing with both the infrastructure bill and the social spending bill. And then the debt limit is sort of looming in the background behind all of it. And how that's going to be resolved remains unclear. So the situation right now when it comes to the debt limit in particular is that Democrats are trying to move forward with this on their own, but Republicans are saying that they are not willing to help at all. So Republicans are saying, even though they want a debt limit increase to happen and recognize that it needs to happen for the reasons that we've just been talking about, they are insisting that Democrats go through the budget reconciliation process to suspend the debt or to increase the debt limit on their own. And what that means is it would take up probably a couple weeks of time in terms of process for Congress to work through revising their budget resolution that they passed earlier this year, which is sort of the framework that they passed before they put in place spending for the year and before they can pass something like their $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill. So they would have to go back and revise that on a party line basis, just Democrats in both the House and the Senate. And then they would have to go back and vote on the debt limit in the House and the Senate. So it would take a lot of time. It's a questionable procedural move that the parliamentarian, which advises on how Senate procedure works, would have to determine is permissible. And it would eat up a lot of the time that they're trying to focus on other issues like these other pieces of legislation. So the Republicans are trying to insist that they go through that route, and the Democrats are saying that they're not going to do that. Right now, the two sides are basically talking past one another. Republicans are saying, you do this alone. Democrats are saying, no, you do this with us, or you at least allow us to do this quickly. And we're not really getting anywhere. So at some point, I expect that dynamic to change. Things in the political world tend to turn very quickly. So I wouldn't be surprised if we wake up one morning and the messaging has changed a little and one side has softened its position. But it's not clear exactly where that's going to come from yet. And so until we get to that moment, it's going to become an increasing concern for investors, for all of us as onlookers, as to what is going to happen with this issue. And I imagine that the folks at the Treasury Department are going to become increasingly concerned about the lack of resolution on this issue. So I would encourage folks to pay close attention for the next couple of weeks, because it's going to come to a head sooner rather than later, but we don't exactly know what that resolution is going to look like at the moment.
Thanks, Shai. Obviously, this is a complex and difficult situation. And to repeat the point you just made, it's not one that we should, I think, expect to be resolved in a day or two, although things are very unpredictable. We have a number of questions from participants. Let me turn to one now. One question I can paraphrase as follows. We've seen this movie before with prior debt ceiling crises or episodes. How do you see the difference, if any, differences between this time and previous significant episodes?
It's a great question. We've come up against the federal debt limit, I want to say somewhere between 10 and a dozen times, give or take, over the last decade. And you can see some of the history and what happened on our website at BPC. But 2011 was probably the closest that we ever came. And that was really the first time in the modern era. So an interesting comparison the folks have been making is back to then, where we came so close to the brink. Back then, it was a little bit of a different dynamic where members of Congress had been elected in sort of a wave election back in back at the beginning, in the 2010 election, getting elected for 2011. And many of those members, if people recall, were Tea Partiers, where they had an emphasis on reducing spending, reducing the size of the federal government, reducing the debt, fiscal responsibility. And that became a big issue, and the debt limit was the focal point for that in the summer of 2011. At that time, there was very limited understanding and knowledge among many of those members in particular, but also other members, because it hadn't really come up in such a pointed way in recent history about what the debt limit was, why it was significant, what some of the consequences could be. And that's actually why we at BPC started our work on the debt limit with Jay Powell at the time. And it was mostly about educating the public and educating members of Congress on what this was and why it was important. So there's a little bit of a different dynamic because we've been through this. We've seen this movie before many times in the last decade. I think most members of Congress understand the gravity of this, and you're not hearing a whole lot of members say, we don't actually need to extend the debt limit. Let's just keep it where it is and start missing payments or see what comes next. I think most members of Congress are not in that camp anymore, but we are at a point where the debt limit has become more purely a political discussion than a substantive one. So even back in 2011, in those negotiations, in those conversations, there were exchanges about how much should be spent, how much should be taxed, what changes we should make to fiscal policy. And ultimately, the resolution was a big fiscal policy package that included some spending cuts, what was called a super committee, where they brought together folks to discuss deficit reduction and other things like that, where it was actually focused on policy around fiscal changes to the trajectory of the United States. Right now, we're not hearing much of that. The two sides are not exchanging offers. The two sides are not saying, I want to spend a little less here, I want to tax a little more here. It's really just about procedure and about the politics. And both sides are trying to frame it in a way that is most beneficial to them, most damaging to the other side. I'm not trying to equate the two or assess blame between the two here, but it really has become just purely this political tool. And so members on both sides, I think in the medium run, are recognizing that this is not an effective way for us to run our government and looking for better alternatives. But in this moment, it's very difficult for the two parties to take a step back from the edge and see that bigger picture. So we are in this gridlock. And my concern that is different also from the 2011 occasion, although this time in, I think, a negative, pessimistic direction, is that this debt limit debate has gotten locked into the other fiscal policy debates that are going on at the same time, specifically the $3.5 trillion spending package, which Democrats have as their biggest priority and Republicans have as their biggest priority to oppose. And when the debt limit messaging gets caught up in that, where Republicans are saying, we're not going to allow Democrats to spend another $3.5 trillion and blow through our debt limit and rack up all this additional debt, and this is the way that we stop them. And Democrats are messaging in the opposite way, saying this is for spending that's already been approved and we need to pay our bills, and this is totally separate from the $3.5 trillion. It becomes a very difficult situation to work out on a brokered negotiation basis, because the two sides aren't really talking about policy. They're talking about how they can best achieve their broader goals. So that's what makes me most concerned about this time. The one other thing I'll mention, I know this is getting to be a long answer, there's a lot of factors here, is the financial markets. Back in 2011, we started to see them panic fairly early, and we started to see higher interest rates being demanded on those securities very early on by a fairly significant amount. We're seeing much more muted reaction this time. And again, as Brian said, I think it's because we've seen this movie before and financial markets are expecting that we know the ending. But that also lessens the pressure on members of Congress, and you have a little bit of a chicken and egg situation where members of Congress, the markets aren't going to get worried until it gets to the last minute, and members of Congress aren't going to act until markets get worried. And what does that do? So folks can recall back in the financial crisis, there was a similar dynamic with TARP, the emergency bailout, for lack of a better term, of some large financial institutions. And the Congress voted down that bill once, and then there was a market plummet. And then they came back and voted for it because that increased pressure. They understood better the gravity of the situation. So I'm not saying that we're necessarily in shaping up for a similar situation, but it has a little bit of that feel to it, where there's not the pressure applied until the last minute when people actually get worried that this isn't going to get resolved.
Thanks, Shai. Let me pick up on one of the points that you alluded to, which is the question of the debt ceiling as a fiscal policy tool. Now, of course, from one perspective, the debt ceiling might be an appropriate and effective fiscal policy tool to discipline the federal budget process. On the other hand, one might observe, as you already have, that there has been tremendous growth in the federal debt over past decades. It's now a very sizable percentage, greater than 100% of nominal GDP. So just on that simple observation alone, one might question whether the debt ceiling has been at all effective in disciplining the federal budget process. Now, a number of analysts and public policy officials, including Federal Reserve Chair Alan Greenspan, close to 20 years ago in congressional testimony, former Federal Reserve Chair Ben Bernanke have recommended or argued that the federal debt ceiling is not a useful policy instrument and should be done away with. And I think just yesterday, Secretary Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, just also expressed a view similar to that. My question is, taking ourselves out of the immediate moment of these fiscal policy discussions and questions about exactly how we will move forward, but also assuming that we get through this current episode without a catastrophe. Do you sense there's some appetite in Congress for going back and taking a look at the usefulness of the federal debt limit as a fiscal policy tool?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I do think there is. I don't think there's the appetite to abolish it anytime soon, even though many Democrats have proposed that. And as you noted, Secretary Yellen just said that in her remarks yesterday. The issue with the debt limit, taking a step back, is that the general public obviously doesn't really understand it for good reason. It is sort of an archaic mechanism, and the general public understands, I would say, very limited amount about federal budgeting in general. But the debt limit as this archaic provision is even less so. And it is much more used in messaging from one side or the other than it is as discussed as a substantive policy, piece of public policy. So the problem there is that the optics, where if you get rid of the debt limit, the average person in the country doesn't understand that you may be making fiscal policy more rational by not going to the brink of default each time. What they hear is, oh, you're tearing up the credit card and you're spending up the wazoo with no restraints. And that becomes the message that comes out of it. And that's not healthy necessarily for either political party, but certainly that's not what the message that the Republican Party is sending at the moment. So I think that is inconsistent with how the two parties are messaging. And so that outcome is unlikely. But what I do think is possible, because there's an increasing recognition on both sides that it's not serving anybody's purpose. And I want to dwell on that point for just a minute. And you made this observation that over the last decade, since that first deal in 2011 that I mentioned, we've actually seen increases in the federal debt or increases in spending or tax cuts that are attached to debt limit legislation more often than we've seen improvements in the other direction. So it's actually counter to the purposes that it's allegedly serving, because the two parties generally come to an agreement where they say, I'll get a little more of my spending, you get a little more of your spending, we'll call it a day and we'll do this again in a year or two. And that's not achieving any sense of fiscal responsibility or sustainability over time. I think we need to look at that after we get past this episode. There are discussions actually going on even within this episode. We at BPC have been providing technical assistance to some members who are trying to change that right now. And the folks who are in the negotiating room know about these conversations. I don't know if anything's going to make it into this legislation, and I certainly wouldn't put my money on it. But after this, I think there will be ongoing discussions about whether there's a better way to do this. And specifically, we need to find a way to de-risk the debt limit where it's not posing this recurring threat to the US and global economy. It can be in effect, and that you can still have Congress retaining their prerogative, but you could have a system where basically, and we've done this on a limited basis a little bit before, so there's a precedent where the president gets the authority to request a debt limit extension or suspension, and Congress can reject that if they want to, and they would need to basically reject it on an overwhelming bipartisan basis in order for it not to go through. So if for some reason both parties think that this request is entirely unwarranted, they can say, no, we're not doing that right now, but otherwise it would basically go through. And you could pair that maybe, and this is the idea that BPC has put forward, with a parallel process where the president also needs to submit a debt reduction plan, so that there's an actual debate about how we improve our fiscal standing, whether it's tax increases or spending cuts. Most of those debates don't really happen naturally, because anytime that a party is proposing some of those things, they're also proposing to spend more money or tax less, and it sort of offsets one another. So that's what we're talking about right now with the $3.5 trillion bill. It may be somewhat or mostly paid for, but that's not actually going to improve our fiscal standing over time. And so having some type of structured process where we talk about specific improvements that we can make, even if it doesn't guarantee an outcome, having that opportunity could substitute for some of the debate, and I put that in quotation marks because it's not really a debate, but some of the hand waving that goes on today around the debt limit, around fiscal responsibility.
So it sounds like we shouldn't anticipate that the debt ceiling will be abolished in the foreseeable future, but possibly there will be some revision to the process that focuses more effectively on the critical fiscal policy issues that are facing the U.S. Shai, members of our audience, in addition to those here in the U.S., are from abroad, and I thought we might address a question or two or present a question or two to you from an international perspective. One is a note that the situation is scary, and the question is, if we focus on the global economy and the global financial system, what might be the effects there, going beyond the US if the X day comes. And also there is a question as to whether you see any implications in our US experience for fiscal policy and debt management policy abroad.
You mean examples abroad for that we could learn from, or vice versa?
Vice versa.
So on the first, sorry.
I said, I think that was the question.
Okay, got it. So on the first question, some of the consequences, again, very difficult to predict, but I think you would likely see interest rates on US Treasuries go up significantly. And those are reference rates for many rates around the world. And so I don't know exactly how that would trickle throughout the global economy, but because the US is considered the most reliable asset on the planet, US Treasury securities, that would likely have ramifications for other securities around the world. Financial markets, as we talked about, that could really pose a threat to them. Hard to predict exactly what will happen, but they could go south in a hurry. I think the other element here is the US dollar's status as reserve currency in the world, meaning that most or many transactions are conducted in US dollars, and we get the privilege of that. And so there's a higher demand for US dollars, and that translates into us paying lower interest rates on our debt. So there's all sorts of benefits that accrue to the United States from that standing. And that's been eroding a little over time. There's been chatter about some other basket of currencies taking its place, or the renminbi in China, or the euro. And I don't think we're necessarily close to any of those happening, although some of the folks on this call may have a better sense of that than I do from an international economics perspective. But I think what this could do is accelerate those conversations, because if there is less confidence in the full faith and credit of the United States and the United States as a global economic leader, then its position, that front runner position, is going to be under threat. And we might not be able to see that erosion. It's not necessarily something you can measure in terms like the stock market, but I think it's a danger that is posed to us over time. There's also the effect, as I mentioned before, of US Treasury securities being used as collateral in many transactions. And so if that collateral is all of a sudden soured and you have defaulted securities being thrown around in the markets, short-term markets could run into a lot of issues. We saw that when the COVID crisis hit us, and the Fed obviously came in with a ton of liquidity to help sort that out. There's been some discussion as to what the Federal Reserve's reaction could be to a US default or a US crossing of the X date, and none of those options look particularly good. It's hard to tell how much of the damage they could quell. The Fed Chair Powell said the other day that nobody should think that the Fed's actions can be a panacea here. We can potentially mitigate, he didn't say this, but they could potentially mitigate the damage, but certainly cannot entirely eliminate it. So that's how I would, I think, respond to the first question. We don't know, but the consequences could be fairly widespread. And then in terms of lessons that the world can learn from our management, if that is the question, we have a real trouble with fiscal policy in this country, and I think it relates to our partisan politics. But the way that I like to put it is the debt is always a higher, when a party is in the minority, debt is always a priority for the party. And when the party is in the majority, it is no longer the priority, because they care about the debt more than their own priorities, more than the other party's priorities, but less than their own priorities. And so when you see one party take power, their top agenda item is almost never reducing the federal debt. It's at best paying for other policies that they want to do, but even that is usually far-fetched. So when we saw Republicans take power when President Trump came into office in 2017, the first big fiscal priority was cutting taxes, and we cut $1.5 trillion or $2 trillion of taxes over the course of the 10-year window. And then now the Democrats are in, and we're talking about a $3.5 trillion or whatever it ends up being spending package. And some or all of it may be paid for, but we're not talking about actual improvements in fiscal policy in the future. So it never rises high enough on the priority list. And we've seen the broker deals that were a regular feature back in the 80s and 90s become more infrequent. So we don't see many occasions now where the two parties are coming together around, we'll stomach a little bit of pain and you'll stomach a little bit of pain, and we'll come together around ways that we can reduce the deficit. It's, again, most of these deals have been, we'll take a little bit of our goodies and you take a little bit of your goodies and we'll make it worse. So in terms of lessons learned, I would not suggest that many countries look to the US for lessons on solid fiscal policy, because I think many other countries have been more responsible than we have on this front. And there's a tendency to kick this can down the road that we've seen a lot of over especially the last decade or two. And unfortunately, I don't expect that to change anytime soon, which is why the theories that go, we can just let this keep going until we get to an unsustainable position, ring hollow to my ears. Because what's to make people think that when we get to that position, we're going to either have good options or have the political will necessary to tackle it then? I think we need to keep the pressure on policymakers now. It hasn't really worked yet, but to keep the pressure on them now to be making fiscally responsible decisions so that we don't get to a point where we are unsustainable or close to that stage.
Thanks, Shai. One truly extraordinary measure, although it's not counted as such in the usual terminology, but it's being widely discussed. It's been widely discussed in recent months. Is for the Treasury to mint a $1 trillion platinum coin and deposit it with the Federal Reserve in exchange for $1 trillion in its deposit account with the Fed. I think some would argue that this is technically legal, but my understanding is that the responsible officials are highly unlikely, to say the least, to take this step. It certainly seems like just a gimmick. Could you give us your take on this recommendation?
Sure, and this has gotten a lot of ammunition on social media and channels like that. I think in part in jest, but also in part seriously, given the alternatives here. So the way I would frame it is that default on the US debt, I think, is the worst option of all of the options that are on the table. So if we are choosing between alternative options and defaulting on the debt, almost anything is better than that. But short of defaulting on the debt, which I think is an unlikely scenario here, the $1 trillion coin, I think, has a lot more consequences and risks than its supporters like to recognize. It's not so much the action itself, but the reaction to that action. So if a $1 trillion coin were minted, first of all, how are the financial markets going to react to that? You're all of a sudden coming up with the largest amount of currency that anyone's ever seen. Is this going to cause inflation expectations to go up? Is it going to cause large fluctuations in the financial markets? Is it going to cause credit rating agencies to say, wait a minute, we're printing $1 trillion coins? Now, this is not how a first-rate economy deals with its financial problems, so we're giving them another downgrade. There's all sorts of implications that could bring on. It could raise interest rates on Treasury securities for people who are saying, all right, I'm just not going to deal with this issue right now. I'm not going to deal with a country that's printing $1 trillion coins. You're going to have Republicans saying that this is a fraudulent printing of $1 trillion coin and that investors should not actually be holding the debt that's being issued because it's not legitimate debt because they're in breach of the debt ceiling. You're going to potentially have legal challenges as to whether this is permissible. So there are all sorts of consequences, and that could spiral very quickly before there's any sense of control from the Treasury Department or the Federal Reserve or policymakers. So I think that the risks there are quite extreme. It's possible it all goes off seamlessly. They print $1 trillion coin, they pay the bills, they pass an increase in the debt limit, they melt the $1 trillion coin so it's not adding to the currency or inflation or anything like that, and we all go on our merry way. That doesn't seem like the most likely scenario to me. And I think some of these other risks are quite significant. It's very difficult to weigh how those compare to the risks of starting to miss payments and having widespread delays and the economic contraction that would over time come along with that. So none of these are appealing options, but I don't think it's the attractive option that some have talked about. There's another one that has come up, which is just declaring the 14th Amendment, so to say, which the 14th Amendment says that the debts of the United States shall not be questioned. And you just unilaterally decide as the Treasury Department that we are going to ignore the debt ceiling and continue issuing debt to pay the nation's bills. Again, I'm not a legal scholar, but that may be legally permissible. But what does that mean if we actually do that? What type of environment are we in where investors, there are now securities being issued where some people are saying these are illegitimate securities, and we have credit rating agencies looking at this, and Republicans are taking an opposing stance because this is what a Democratic Treasury Department has done. It's not going to be a pretty picture. And again, is it a prettier picture than defaulting on our debt? Probably. Is it a prettier picture than some of the other unappealing alternatives? Maybe, but it's not something that we should take lightly, and it's not something that we should take as a preferable resolution to just extending the debt limit and reaching some agreement among policymakers, which is, of course, what they're paid to do and what we need them to do in this moment.
Thanks, Shai. One more question that actually relates very closely to some of the issues that we've already raised, some of the comments that you've already made, but I think it provides a good focus and possible ending point for the discussion today. And I'll read it almost verbatim. Will the market not differentiate the default, of course, assuming there was a default, due to political deadlock and due to genuine economic conditions on the one hand or the other? Why should the market panic if they know that this is due to political deadlock, which could be resolved at any time?
It's a good question. I don't expect that we'll see the same effects as we would, if a Greece defaulted or if there was some country that was really unable to pay its debts. I don't expect US interest rates are going to go up to 15% or anything like that. But I do think if you put yourself in the shoes of an investor, particularly investors that are holding securities that are maturing around the time when this default occurs, many investors hold US Treasury securities, especially short-term bills, for liquidity, and they're used again as collateral for other transactions. So if the main reason they're holding these is so that they can deal them at any given moment because they're earning very, very little interest on them, then if that attractiveness goes away all of a sudden, are they going to pull back? Probably many will. Are they going to start demanding higher interest rates to put their money into a security that they don't even know if they're going to get paid back on time? Almost certainly. So we don't know what the ramifications of that are. We don't know how a Treasury auction of new debt would go off at a time when, what another risk here that actually Chairman Powell has emphasized over time, and specifically when I worked with him, is that the US rolls over a very large number of securities on a weekly basis, hundreds of billions of dollars. And to roll those over, debt is maturing, and then we issue new debt to new investors, sometimes the same investors, to replace that debt. And in an environment where we're actually not paying on time certain securities, what are those new folks who are purchasing our securities at the auction going to look like? Who is going to say, I'm going to take on US debt for exactly the same rate as I would have before in an environment where they're not paying everyone back on time? And it might be most of the same people do, but that is a risk there. And if something were to go wrong in that normal functioning cycle, it could have really serious consequences if we can't actually raise the cash to pay our bills. So I wouldn't equate this to other countries that have defaulted on their debt for purely economic reasons. But when it comes to the credit rating agencies, when it comes to investors, I expect that there will be serious consequences if we default, regardless of whether it's for political reasons or whether it's for economic reasons.
Thanks, Shai. Actually, there is just one more question, if you have a minute or two more.
Sure.
That's particularly timely. And it also relates to this question of how is this episode different than previous ones? And it is previous debt limit scenarios didn't have COVID to deal with, which definitely impacts fiscal situations globally. Is COVID part of the narrative this time around?
Yeah, so specifically when it comes to the projections around when the X date might occur, the effects of COVID have made things much more uncertain. As I talked about at the top, there's already a lot of unpredictability when it comes to figuring out what the X date is because it relies on projecting or estimating all of these hundreds of millions of payments that come in and out on a regular basis. Some of those are quite knowable. So the Social Security benefits, for example, we know what day of the month those go out. We know almost exactly what the amount of those is going to be. And so we can build those into the projections quite easily. Others are more erratic, but especially some of the COVID spending goes out on a very irregular basis. A good example is the payments that are going out to state and local governments. There was I think it was about $250 billion in the American Rescue Plan that was passed to go to state and local governments. And that money goes out the door to individual state and local governments as they apply for it and as they're approved for it. And that's not on any type of normal schedule. So what we see in the Treasury statements is you might have $5 billion going out one day and then nothing going out for the rest of the week. And then $10 billion going out the next Monday and nothing going out for the rest of the week, or something going out on Friday. And so for us to try to figure out what the timing of that is going to be is a lot of conjecture, educated guessing. And another example of this is the Paycheck Protection Loan Forgiveness, where that was a program that was put in place to give loans to small businesses to help them get through the worst of the crisis. And now those loans are being forgiven, as was written into the original legislation, for many businesses if it was spent on appropriate uses. When the financial institutions forgive the loans that they made to these small businesses, they request that they be reimbursed from the Small Business Administration. We don't know how quickly those requests are going to come in, when they're going to come in, just like we don't know when Professor Madigan or others in the audience are going to pay their taxes. Those come into the Treasury Department on a fairly irregular basis. We know when there's going to be a huge amount of tax payments during tax season, but we don't know when quarterly taxes exactly are going to be paid by individuals, when refund checks are going to go out to those individuals. There's a lot of unexpected payments that come in and out of the government, and COVID has made that even more unpredictable. And then the final element here is the revenue growth, which speaks to the macroeconomic question that we have today, where there was clearly a recovery underway in the spring and early summer as we got vaccinations fully underway and appeared to be coming out of the worst of the crisis. But then with the Delta variant, that seems to have put a crimp on things. And we are now in a very uncertain situation about whether we still have fairly strong growth or things have taken a stronger turn for the worse. And we'll get more information on that in the coming weeks and months. But what it means for revenues is we've certainly seen a plateau in the growth of revenues over time. And what that's going to mean for the next few weeks, do they continue to start growing again a little bit? Do they continue to trend downwards? That is unclear. And even if it's just a few percentage points, because of how much the government is taking in and how much that contributes to this formula, that can have an impact of certainly days, if not even a week or two, on when the X date is, which is why we continue to have that range. And we'll be able to narrow that as there's less points of uncertainty and more data as we get closer to that range.
Well, thank you very much, Shai. I don't know if you have any concluding points that you want to raise, but perhaps one very short question would be, is your assessment of the situation that this could be resolved sooner rather than later, or is it more likely that it will be mid-October or beyond, where hopefully this will be concluded without major problems?
Well, one regular dynamic of Congress is that they like to take things to deadlines and not do things before they have to. And that gets back to the pressure that's being put on them. And they want to make it seem like they fought tooth and nail to the end and got the best that they could for their position. When it comes to the debt limit, that obviously has consequences that we've been discussing. I expect that they will get fairly close to that drop dead date that Secretary Yellen has put forward. I think it's probably helpful that there is a date out there, even though she doesn't necessarily know that that is what we call the X date because of the uncertainty we've been discussing. But it allows people to wrap their heads around when action is needed by and hopefully get to a resolution sooner rather than later. I would pay close attention in the next couple of weeks. My baseline scenario is that this gets resolved before anything really nasty happens, but I don't think that we should be complacent about the fact that we've seen this movie before. We're sitting here a few weeks away from the government not paying all of its bills, which should be concerning to all of us as people who are recipients of those bills, as people who are relying on the US economy. And so hopefully Congress will resolve it sooner rather than later.
Well, I think we need to start to wrap up now. I'd like to thank you, Shai, very much for sharing your time and expertise with us today. This is a very important issue for the United States and for the global economy. And we really appreciate all of your insights. So thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to be here.
Thanks.